Hey history enthusiasts, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most bizarre and unsettling events in recorded history. An event so strange that even centuries later, historians and scientists are still debating what really happened. Picture this, it's July 1518, in Strasbourg, France. A woman steps into the street and begins to dance, and she doesn't stop. Days pass, then weeks, and soon, hundreds of people join her in a relentless, exhausting dance that some wouldn't survive. This is the story of the Dancing Plague of 1518, a real historical event that sounds like something out of a horror film. So, buckle up, because we're about to explore every documented detail of this medieval mystery. Before we dive into the dancing itself, we need to understand the world these people were living in. The year is 1518, and we're in Strasbourg, technically part of the Holy Roman Empire at this time, though the city had a complex relationship with France throughout its history. Strasbourg, in the early 16th century, was a city under immense strain. The previous decades had been brutal. We're talking famine, disease, and economic hardship hitting the population again and again. Between 1495 and 1518, the region experienced multiple crop failures. Smallpox swept through in 1517, just a year before our story begins. Syphilis was spreading across Europe. The people of Strasbourg were living in what we can only describe as constant crisis mode. The population was dealing with malnutrition, poverty, and the psychological weight of watching their loved ones die from disease and starvation. This context is crucial because it sets the stage for what's about to happen. These weren't people living comfortable lives who suddenly decided to dance. These were people pushed to their absolute limits. Now, let's get to July 1518. The exact date most sources cite is July 14th. In a narrow street in Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Troffea stepped outside and began to dance. Not at a party, not at a celebration, just in the street, alone. And here's where it gets disturbing. She didn't stop. Contemporary accounts tell us she danced for days without rest. Her feet became bloody. She was clearly exhausted. But she kept dancing. Historical records, including notes from the Strasbourg City Council and chronicles written by physicians of the time, document this clearly. This wasn't a brief episode. Frau Troffea danced for somewhere between 4 and 6 days straight. Now, you might be thinking, surely someone stopped her. Here's the thing. Medieval understanding of medicine and psychology was vastly different from ours. When people saw Frau Troffea dancing uncontrollably, many interpreted it through the lens of religious fervor, divine punishment, or demonic possession. Her husband reportedly tried to help her, but the dancing continued. Within a week of Frau Troffea's dancing, something absolutely terrifying happened. Other people joined her. Not because they wanted to dance. Historical sources describe these people as dancing involuntarily, compulsively, as if driven by some unseen force. By August, the number of dancers had swelled dramatically. Historical records vary on the exact numbers, but multiple sources from the period document that anywhere from 50 to 400 people were affected at the peak of this outbreak. Chronicles from Sebastian Brandt, a well-known local author and humanist, along with notes from physician Paracelsus, who later studied the event, plus the official Strasbourg Chronicle, all confirm this happened. These weren't organized dance parties. Witnesses described the dancers as appearing tortured, desperate, unable to stop. Their feet were bleeding. They were collapsing from exhaustion. Some reportedly died from heart attacks, strokes, or sheer physical exhaustion. The number of deaths is disputed. Some sources claim around 15 deaths, though exact numbers are difficult to verify from surviving records. So what did the authorities do? This is where the story takes an even stranger turn. The Strasbourg City Council and local physicians consulted on the problem and their solution. They decided the afflicted needed to dance it out of their systems. I know, it sounds counterintuitive, but this was based on the medical theory of the time. The physicians believed this was a case of hot blood, an imbalance in the body's humors. According to humoral theory, which dominated medieval medicine, the body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess of hot blood, they theorized, could cause this uncontrollable dancing, and their prescribed cure: more dancing, to essentially sweat it out. The city council took this advice seriously. They constructed stages. They hired musicians. Professional dancers were brought in to help the afflicted dance continuously. Halls and guild halls were opened up as dedicated dancing spaces. This wasn't some small intervention. This was a citywide, organized response. We know this happened because we have the receipts. Literally, city council records show payments made to musicians and for the construction of these dancing stages. One document mentions payment to pipers and drummers specifically hired to play for the dancers. When the dancing cure failed to work, and in fact, seemed to make things worse by encouraging more people to join, the authorities shifted strategies. They turned to religion. The city banned public dancing and music. The stages were dismantled. The musicians were sent away. Instead, the afflicted were taken to religious sites. Many were brought to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus at Savin, in a chapel located on a mountaintop. Saint Vitus was, and still is, the Catholic patron saint of dancers and epileptics. The choice wasn't random. There was a long tradition in medieval Europe of associating uncontrollable dancing with Saint Vitus. In fact, other dancing epidemics throughout medieval Europe were often called Saint Vitus's dance. The afflicted were made to pray at the shrine. They were given small crosses and holy water. Red shoes were placed on their feet, a specific ritual practice associated with Saint Vitus cures. The priests held special masses and prayer services for their recovery. And here's what's remarkable. This approach seemed to work. Historical records indicate that after the religious interventions, the dancing plague gradually subsided. By early September 1518, the outbreak had largely ended. Let's pause here and talk about our sources, because it's important to understand what we actually know versus what's speculation. The dancing plague of 1518 is documented in multiple contemporary sources. First, we have Sebastian Brandt's chronicle. Brandt was a humanist scholar living in Strasbourg at the time. He didn't just hear about this second-hand, he witnessed it. His accounts describe the dancers and the city's response in detail. Second, we have the Strasbourg City Council records. These administrative documents record the payments made for musicians and stages, proving the city's official response. Third, we have medical treatises, written by physicians, who either witnessed the event or studied it shortly after. Paracelsus, one of the most famous physicians of that era, wrote about the incident, though his account came slightly later. Fourth, there are various chronicle entries from the period that mention the outbreak. Different monasteries and civic institutions kept records, and multiple sources reference this event. What's important is that these sources largely corroborate each other on the basic facts. The dancing started in July 1518. It involved dozens to hundreds of people. It lasted for weeks. The city tried both medical and religious interventions, and people died. Here's something crucial. Strasbourg, 1518, wasn't the only dancing plague in medieval Europe. It was just the best documented. The first major recorded instance was in 1374, in Aachen, Germany. From there, it spread along the Rhine River, affecting towns and cities across the region. Thousands of people were reportedly affected across multiple locations. In 1518 itself, even before the Strasbourg outbreak, there were reports of dancing manias in other areas of Alsace and Germany. Strasbourg was part of a broader pattern. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, there are multiple documented cases of dancing epidemics across Germany, the Low Countries, and France. Some lasted days. Others lasted weeks. The symptoms were remarkably consistent: involuntary, compulsive dancing, inability to stop despite exhaustion, physical collapse, and in some cases, death. What's fascinating is that these outbreaks seemed to cluster in times and places experiencing extreme stress. Famine, plague, economic collapse, religious upheaval, they appeared most frequently in the Germanic regions during periods of social crisis. So what actually caused this? Let's look at the main theories, starting with mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. This is the explanation favored by many modern historians and psychologists who've studied the event. Mass psychogenic illness is a real documented phenomenon, where groups of people develop similar physical symptoms with no identifiable physical cause. The symptoms are real, people aren't faking. But they're generated by psychological stress rather than infection or poisoning. Here's how this theory applies to Strasbourg. The population was under extreme stress. Years of famine, disease, and death had created a traumatized community. In medieval Europe, there was already a cultural framework for understanding uncontrollable dancing. St. Vitus's dance was a known phenomenon. People had heard stories about it. According to this theory, Frau Trofia's initial dancing was likely a stress response, a psychological break triggered by trauma, perhaps related to personal loss or suffering. When others saw her dancing and heard the interpretations being offered, divine punishment, demonic possession, hot blood, some individuals, already primed by extreme stress and cultural expectations, began to experience similar symptoms. This would explain why the city's initial response, encouraging more dancing, made things worse. It provided social permission and expectation for the behavior. It normalized what was happening and potentially drew more people into the episode. It also explains why the religious intervention worked. When the authorities changed their approach, removed the public dancing spaces, and redirected the afflicted toward prayer and pilgrimage, they disrupted the social reinforcement of the behavior. The pilgrimage to St. Vitus's shrine provided a clear path to recovery, a narrative that said this can end. Historical psychologist John Waller has written extensively about this interpretation. His research into the historical context of Strasbourg supports the mass psychogenic illness explanation. The timing, the social conditions, and the pattern of spread all fit this model. But there's another theory that gets mentioned frequently: ergot poisoning. Let's examine this carefully. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. When consumed, it can cause ergotism, a serious poisoning. The symptoms include convulsions, hallucinations, crawling sensations on the skin, and spasms. In severe cases, it causes gangrene and death. In medieval times, ergotism was called St. Anthony's fire because of the burning sensations it caused. Here's why some people have suggested ergot as a cause. The region had experienced poor harvests and damp conditions. Ideal for ergot growth, ergot poisoning can cause convulsive movements, and the people of Strasbourg would have been eating a lot of rye bread due to food scarcity. However, most historians and medical experts today don't think ergot explains the dancing plague of 1518. Here's why. First, ergot poisoning causes random, jerky convulsions, not coordinated dancing movements. Witnesses described the Strasbourg dancers as actually dancing, with rhythmic movements, not just convulsing. Second, Ergot poisoning comes with severe gastrointestinal symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, severe abdominal pain. Contemporary accounts don't mention these symptoms in the dancers. Third, ergot poisoning typically affects entire communities that eat from the same grain supply fairly uniformly. But the dancing plague affected specific individuals who then seemed to spread it to others through social contact, not through shared food sources. Fourth, ergot poisoning doesn't explain why the dancing stopped when religious interventions were applied. A poisoning would need to run its course or be treated medically. It wouldn't respond to prayer and pilgrimage. And finally, other documented cases of ergotism from medieval Europe don't describe dancing. They describe the convulsions, the burning sensations, the gangrene, but not the specific pattern of rhythmic, continuous dancing seen in these outbreaks. So why should we care about something that happened over 500 years ago? Because the dancing plague of 1518 teaches us important lessons about human psychology, social dynamics, and how communities respond to crisis. First, it demonstrates how real physical symptoms can emerge from psychological distress. The dancers weren't faking. They were genuinely unable to stop, genuinely exhausted, genuinely suffering. This helps us understand modern cases of mass psychogenic illness, which still occur today. We see similar patterns in certain modern outbreaks, where groups of people develop real physical symptoms with no identifiable physical cause. Understanding historical cases like Strasbourg helps medical professionals recognize and treat these events. Second, it shows us how cultural context shapes the expression of psychological distress. The specific form the dancing plague took, uncontrollable dancing, was shaped by medieval European culture's existing narratives about Saint Vitus's dance. Today, mass psychogenic illness takes different forms because our cultural context is different. Third, it illustrates both the power and the danger of social contagion. The initial response in Strasbourg, building stages, hiring musicians, encouraging dancing, likely made the outbreak worse by normalizing and reinforcing the behavior. This has implications for how we respond to social contagion today. Whether we're talking about harmful behaviors spreading through social media or panic responses to perceived threats. And fourth, it reminds us of the profound impact of sustained trauma and stress on communities. The people of Strasbourg weren't weak or foolish. They were a population pushed past their breaking point by years of crisis. Their story is a reminder to take collective trauma seriously and to provide communities with real support during times of sustained hardship. So there you have it, the complete story of the dancing plague of 1518. Based on actual historical records and contemporary accounts, we've traced it from Frau Trofia's first steps in July, through the peak of the outbreak affecting hundreds, to the religious interventions that finally ended it in September. We know this happened. We have multiple primary sources documenting it. What remains debated is the exact cause, with most modern experts favoring mass psychogenic illness over ergot poisoning or other biological explanations. What strikes me most about this story is how human it is. These were real people, living through real suffering, who experienced something extraordinary and terrifying. They did their best to understand and respond to it with the knowledge they had. The city officials tried to help, first with their medical understanding, then with religious intervention. The community came together to address a crisis they didn't fully understand. The dancing plague reminds us that history isn't just dates and names. It's people facing challenges, trying to survive and make sense of their world. And sometimes, under extreme pressure, the human mind and body respond in ways that seem impossible. What do you think? Does the mass hysteria explanation convince you, or do you think there might be something else at play? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's strangest events, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We've got more historical mysteries coming your way. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, history is always stranger than fiction.